All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining Tricycle's online practice session today. My name is Danya, and I'm Tricycle's online learning manager. And I'm very happy to introduce Laura Bridgman and Gavin Milne as our guest teachers today. Laura ordained as a Buddhist nun in 1995 and was a resident at Amaravati and Chithurst monasteries under the guidance of her teachers Ajahn Sumedho and Ajahn Suchito. And Laura left the monastic tradition in 2015 and is now staff support teacher at Gaia House, a retreat center in Devon, in England. And she's spent extended periods practicing as well with the Burmese teacher Sayadaw Tejaniya. And Gavin Milne has been practicing insight meditation since 2004 and was invited to train as a teacher under the guidance of Janai Pastelnik in 2015. Inspired and influenced by other paths as well, Gavin is particularly interested in exploring practice wherever we find ourselves, whether in the midst of family life or responding to the wider issues of our era. So I'm really happy to invite you both here today to be with us. So a few quick notes before we start. Today's session will be recorded for viewing on Tricycle's YouTube page after. And Laura and Gavin will start out with some teaching and a guided practice. And toward the end of our session today, we'll have time for Q&A. So we invite you to come on screen to ask your questions live on video if you'd like, using the raise hand button on Zoom. Or you can also post your written questions in the Q&A panel below the video screen. And just note that if you ask a question on video, you will be in the recording afterward. And if you're tuning in today from Facebook Live, then you can post a question in the comments there on Facebook, and we'll add it to our list here and get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Laura and Gavin, for being with us here today, and I'll turn it over to you both now.
So, hello everyone. I can't see you, but you can see me, so I'm tuning into you. And I'd just like to pause for a moment actually and just invite you also just to tune in to this sense of gathering, the sense of coming together with this intention to contemplate this particular topic. So although we can't see each other, we might just have this sense of the others present in this space, coming together from so many different parts of the world. I just find it very helpful to tune into this sense of connecting, particularly at this time when our connection with other people has been so radically changed. So the topic for today is how to understand, how to contemplate the conditioning of the inner critic, what's referred to as the inner critic. And many of you might have your own sense of what that term means to you. But the way I like to refer to it is it can be known most easily by the results of it, by the way we're left feeling. And that can often be this quality of deficiency or not quite measuring up, not quite feeling enough. And that feeling is a consequence of a certain inner narrative or inner pattern of thinking, an inner perspective. So this narrative, this inner narrative, is like a commentary, an inner commentary on our behavior and actions. And it can be an inner commentary that lingers in the past, refers to the past. And when it does that, it's a kind of guilt tripping. It's like that in us, which reminds us of our past mistakes, but in a way where it's somewhat, to some degree, blaming or shaming. You might have this sense of where you keep going round in a certain groove of a memory, and it's like aggravating a wound. It's like not letting something heal. Something keeps going back to this sense of guilt or wrongness, or having got it wrong. How the inner critic narrative can show up and how it frames our memories, our perceptions of the past. I mean, there's many ways it can do that. It can show up in the past, but that's one way in terms of the sense of guilt. And the inner critic is different to a more constructive critiquing of our experience. So more constructive critiquing of our experience in reference to the past could be something like a quality of remorse. So what's the difference between a feeling guilty and a feeling of remorse? So with remorse, there can be a sense of, I need to learn something from this. I want to understand so that in the future, I may be able to bring more wisdom, bring more discernment, bring more discrimination to that set of circumstances if they arise again. It doesn't personally put us down, doesn't make us wrong for what happened. Whereas when we feel guilty, we can often have this sense of personal wrongness, not really being okay as we are. And the quality of remorse, it allows us to make mistakes and learn from our mistakes. If you think about children, how young children best learn, they best learn by knowing they're loved, knowing it's okay to learn through making mistakes, to reflect and discern, oh, what happened there? What led to that? And there's a kind of relaxation and openness in that allows us to unfold. And in that relaxation, it also allows us to see more clearly what happened. Something about feeling criticized, feeling a sense of wrongness, it brings a certain contraction, certain diminishment in us that can make it hard for us to really see clearly and objectively the circumstances or the conditions at play in that particular situation, and really more objectively evaluate it. So that's a way the inner critic can show up in the past. It can show up in the present moment in the quality of perfectionism. In a way, we can set ourselves really high standards of how we should be, how we should pave, what we should be achieving in our lives. And the interesting thing is, however high that standard is, for this inner narrative, there's always more. It's like a false ridge. If you're climbing a mountain, we get to that ridge and then we suddenly see there's another mountain, another part of the mountain ahead of us. So we never feel quite fulfilled. We might have a moment where there's a sense of satisfaction, a sense of okayness. But then this narrative of the inner critic could just bring in another pressure, another ideal to aim towards. And it's the difference between this and aspirations. It's the difference between this perfectionism that puts a kind of certain pressure on us and aspiration. So aspiration takes into account that we can do the best we can, but we're not completely in control of all the conditions at play. There's so many things in our lives we don't have control over. Yet the inner critic can make us more responsible than we actually are, more accountable than we really are. Whereas an aspiration is something we aim for, it stretches us, but it's achievable for us. And the way the inner critic shows up in terms of the future is in terms of undermining us. So this can be in words, this narrative, which brings in some doubt about our capacity to do a particular job, for instance, or even succeed in our meditation practice. So this undermining voice that kind of discourages us sometimes from even trying what we would like to try for fear that we might fail. So it brings in a lot of doubt. It limits us. It does, and the alternative to this undermining voice is allowing ourselves to experiment and see what happens. Allowing us to have the courage to meet experience afresh and find out as we go along. We don't have to be the one who succeeds or fails, gets it right or gets it wrong, according to the measurements of the evaluations of the inner critic, this inner narrative. So those are just a few examples of how the inner critic shows up, but more specifically, in the way it shows up, it takes a particular experience in our lives, particular way we've behaved, particular thing we've said or done. It takes an incident in our lives and judges it, and then makes that judgment into a global assessment of who we are as a person. So, for instance, we lost our car keys, or we were driving somewhere and we lost our way. So that's the incident. There's simply losing our car keys. There's simply losing our direction. And the inner critic will take that instant and say, there you go again. You're so stupid. Why don't you read the map properly? So it takes something specific and it makes it into what it makes it into actually is a perception of self that we take to be real and valid. It takes a particular incident, judges it, comments on it, and evaluates us as a person in terms of that judgment. And this is really where the pain and suffering of the inner critic lies. And the reason I really like to, well, obviously it's a really painful topic to enter into, to look at. But the reason I have undertaken or am inspired to teach about this particular topic is I know so many people who suffer from this particular way of thinking and perceiving. I know people who I used to live with in the monastery, people who have really noble intentions and high aspirations. And it comes out in this sense of just not really recognizing or appreciating our goodness, but instead just focusing on the so-called mistakes in a particular way, being hard on ourselves. And the other thing I find really interesting about the inner critic is how it can almost be our individual secret, somewhat kept below the radar. But as soon as we allow it to be named, we find how common it is, how shared this suffering is. And that knowing can be incredibly helpful. It can help us be not judging of the judge itself. So Gavin and I are running a course at the moment through Tricycle, and on this topic of the inner critic, and we're inviting the people participating in this course to take this voice, which is often just hovering in the background, sort of insinuating, implying things about us, but sort of almost somewhat below the level of consciousness. And we're inviting, bringing it round into full view of our awareness. We really want to see and understand this particular way our mind is conditioned. Understand the roots of it, what gives rise to it, and understand what allows it to, in a sense, stand aside and allow a more centered, connected guidance to come through. So I'm going to hand over to Gavin now to say a few words, and then after we've spoken, after a short meditation, we'll have an opportunity to hear questions from you.
Thank you, Laura. And very good to be here with you all. I thought originally I might be able to see everyone's faces on the screen, but with so many of us, it's probably good to do it this way. So I'm still looking at Laura at my end, which is rather delightful. We don't live so far away from each other here in Devon, and just to really say from the off, I hope you're doing okay. It's challenging times for all of us, and there's that sense of unity across continents and borders and boundaries that we're kind of all in this together, and all the myriad things that seem to be coming to the surface at the moment. And it just feels like a great time to explore these teachings that point directly at the predicament of suffering on all these different levels, which these teachings of unified beings through the ages. And it was lovely, Danya, just explaining the offerings of Tricycle, these open sessions, hearing different voices, different slants on the teaching, and just what a rich time it is in terms of having access to all these different things. And I hope they're a real support for you all during these times, and many of us in isolated situations. And that's precisely the situation where things like the inner critic actually can start to feel pretty strong when it's a little bit more hemmed in. So if that is your experience, then there'll be many of us that are experiencing the same thing. And it's funny, isn't it, these things that we keep to ourselves a lot, and we think we're the only one, only to discover maybe one of the things that's most common between all of us is that we're all experiencing this experience of sort of loneliness and thinking that we're the only one. And for so many years, this was my own experience. So this particular shining of a light on the inner critic has just been a significant turning point for me in my life, and also, you know, my path of practice. And I suppose this is one of the elements that I find really interesting and really curious, and actually also really quite exciting, whilst acknowledging the pain that this pattern causes us. There's probably quite a lot of us here today that are, what we could probably call ourselves meditators, whether we're new to meditation. There might be some here that haven't meditated at all, but there's probably a few of us that are kind of exploring meditation, and probably many of us that have been doing this for some time. And a little bit echoing what Laura was mentioning there, but I was reflecting on this a little bit earlier on today, but I remember a teacher who I was sitting a retreat with a few years ago, and it was a fairly small comment in the scheme of the teaching, but it was something that stuck with me because I knew that it was true for me. The teacher said, you know, the thing that comes up most often in one-to-one sessions with all the students I meet, this was a teacher meeting many students, is the inner critic or the inner judge. And I thought that was curious in two ways. One, just that it's so prevalent, you know, that it was just so clearly the thing that came up, probably even more than talking about, you know, concentration or craving or clinging and this type of thing. But also, again, that sense of it maybe being kind of spoken about a little bit more behind closed doors, you know, that, you know, when I was on that retreat, I was sort of looking at everyone else, and they were all, or my perception was that everyone was sort of meditating away perfectly, and I was the only one in struggling along in the way that I was, and being tormented perhaps by this inner voice. And actually to discover maybe many others had that experience too was quite a kind of stark thing to let in. So I feel curious in a way about the ways that this inner critic, not just voice, but also a kind of experience that we have that can feel like a sort of descending, kind of getting very small, like sort of, you know, sometimes in social situations was where I used to have it, where it would make me feel very small. Just the way that this can somehow co-opt our spiritual practice, our spiritual path. And I really appreciated it one time when someone said to me, you know, whenever you're reading a Dharma book, or you're listening to a Dharma talk, or you're listening to meditation instruction, your inner critic is also listening to all of that. And for me, the way it played out is it seemed to sort of, the inner critic sort of co-opted my spiritual practice for quite a long time in a way where I just wasn't seeing it. You know, I was trying to be very wholesome in many ways, but I was completely being driven by the inner critic, and it would latch on to things around how generous I was being, how kind I was being, how good a listener I was being, how much effort I was putting into my practice, just the whole thing. And this was really quite painful. And you know, painful also because I didn't really notice it in a certain way, and it sort of started to kind of manifest really as a sense that actually, you know, things like self-esteem and self-value and self-worth were not necessarily getting any better for a period of time in my own practice. And this may not be the case for many people. This maps very well to my kind of whole sort of the way that I'd lived my life prior to then, you know, really sort of perfectionist, trying to get things right, very significant imposter syndrome, the whole shebang. So it's inevitable in a way that was all going to kind of happen when through the practice of the Dharma as well. But it certainly is true to say that it was a significant shift to finally start to illuminate, and just as Laura put it beautifully, just this sort of sense of something here starting to come around here, and actually to include the whole myriad kind of sense of feeling and the sense of wrongness that can be there when the inner critic's there. You know, this sense of this experience is just wrong, something has to be done here. To realize, maybe this in itself is not a wrong experience, just started to feel so inclusive. so inclusive. And there was also this sense of, perhaps for the first time, starting to get a sense and find what my own middle way needed to be. So the inner critic might have a very clear idea of what the middle way needs to be in terms of efforting and in terms of, you know, maybe how many retreats we ought to go on, or how, you know, how anything really, how much of something we ought to do. But as soon as it started to kind of come into the light, this is the inner critic voice kind of telling me that something's wrong with me, that I haven't done good enough, that I'm not practicing right, all these things. And to be curious about that, it's almost like, well, what do I do if I'm not really being driven by this so much? And just a sort of a sense of more balance started to come into the picture, more of a sense of, okay, so it's not about me, you know, cramming as much sort of sitting meditation practice as I can in this one day of practice that I've got available. Not if it's being driven by this critical, harsh inner voice. It's maybe lean the other way a little bit more, and, you know, kind of just feel those feelings that don't want to be felt, and this kind of sense of more space started to open up. So almost just to share a little bit of my sort of own journey with this, and just, you know, various questions emerge about, you know, maybe this is something to do with the conditioning of our era, and, you know, there's so much of a sense of individualism and in feeling individualistic and needing to do things on our own and make things work. It might just be that this is a really significant piece of the puzzle, and it's something that can also be included, which is kind of what Laura and I are exploring on this course over the next few weeks. It's like, when we fully include this piece as well, what do we discover? And of course, when we start to get curious about it, also start to kind of, how do you show up all the different sort of critical voices? How do you show up during my day? It can just start to support some of those qualities that the inner critic is trying to have us get in touch with. But we can include it also. So curiosity, awareness, a sense of kindness is really important here as well. So the inner critical voice is so harsh. And, you know, this kind of age-old sense that really at the heart of these teachings is the transformation through understanding. It is about coming into contact with certain experiences along the way. It absolutely is, for sure. But really a more reliable way is understanding all the things that stand in the way of that, all the obstacles that we experience, the things that take us away from wanting to connect with ourselves as we are in the present moment. This is really unmistakably there in the Buddha's teachings as that which really leads to lasting liberation, lasting freedom. And so in that spirit, sort of inviting the inner critic into the foreground is really part of that. What are you up to? And there is this sense that it has also served us in many ways through our lives, but maybe not so much when we come to meditation and a path of awakening, you could say. So in that spirit, we'd like to offer, I mean, there's much one could say about this topic, but this is just to give you a flavour and a taster, really, and just that kind of invitation to be a little bit on the lookout for this pattern in the current circumstances that we're all in. But in the spirit of having introduced this to you, we'd like to offer a short meditation that, in a sense, emphasizes the kind of orientation that can be helpful to explore if one's very used to being very sort of effortful and driven and quite sort of rigid sometimes in meditation practice. Then to explore a kind of more spacious, open kind of orientation and attitude can be an interesting thing to do. So we'd like to take about 10 minutes just now. So wherever you are, some uprightness is usually useful for meditation practice. But if you find yourself sort of needing to lie down today or be in a different posture, that's completely fine as well. And we'll just practice together for 10 minutes, and I'll ring the bell at the end and offer a few bits of guidance during that 10 minutes. So there's this sense of at least having the intention to allow the fullness of our experience today. Of course, our experience is a mixture of pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant experience. And this can include all the thinking loops that we find ourselves in, just the way we tense up around pain and discomfort in this body of ours that feels so challenged so often. Emotions that can feel many, many different ways, and sometimes we feel like they're going to last forever. There might just be some general pain and discomfort in the body today. So what's it like to just give some awareness to the whole of your experience? And with this orientation, we can just sense into qualities of a kind of open, spacious awareness. A kindness that allows our experience to be however it is, so we don't have to feel kind or a particular feeling, but just a sense of, I turn towards myself with kindness. And just a sense of gentle curiosity. What is this experience that I can notice and connect with whenever awareness shows up? So in this way, we can also be light and allowing around the way that we get lost in meditation practice. The mind wanders, sometimes many, many times, to do with how our day's been, to do with situations we've been in. It doesn't need to be so much about us. And yet in those moments where awareness is there, we have this opportunity to be a little curious, this ever-changing moment. So it's the only moment, this moment. And so with this sense of kind of open, kind awareness, we can still have the breathing there, the center of things. Just noticing the movement and sensations of the breathing. something that we can center this awareness around. So you may sort of naturally notice some of these kind of forces and movements that if we weren't sat here would have us doing something else or trying to make something else happen or try to fix or change something. And sometimes they can be strong enough to have us decide to not sit with ourselves, not practice. What's it like to include these two? There might be a sense of inner judgment or evaluation or comparison happening. These are the three key ways the inner critic can show up. There might be a feeling of kind of lack of value, of deficiency, of maybe even a sense of shame for many of us. This is so with us everywhere we go. So just exploring what it's like to offer kind awareness, maybe these parts of you want something from you. It's to be met, given some space to ease and relax in their own time.
Thank you both, Gavin and Laura. And we invite anyone to raise your hands for questions if you have them at this point, or you can also post them in the Q&A panel. Did you have anything else you wanted to share after as well, Gavin, or are you good to move on to questions?
No, thanks, Dania. I was keeping an eye on time there and thought it'd be nice to move on to questions at this point. Yeah, thank you.
So, Nancy, I'm going to invite you. You have your hand raised. All right, Nancy, are you there? Not yet. All right, we might move to Philip. Oh, I think, sorry, I'm having some difficulties here. All right, I'm gonna allow Philip to talk. Are you there, Philip? Did you have a question?
Yes. Can I go ahead?
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I just would be curious about your observation. You know, everybody says the inner voice is our inner critic, but I actually view it as my inner friend.
Mm-hmm.
The inner voice is really our inner child calling to be heard because it doesn't feel safe, loved, or worthy. We lose our car keys. And yes, from an adult perspective, I made a mistake. But from the inner child's perspective, I have lost the keys. I have not done something right. In order to be loved by my caregivers, I need to be perfect. This triggers the memory. So when we come to the moment and call it inner critic, we are starting from a critical perspective. Wouldn't it be better to say, you know what? Everything that our mind says, the intentionality is skillful, to be safe, loved, and worthy. What a great way to generate self-compassion by remembering that this is our child. What a great way to disidentify by recognizing that this is our child. And so I would propose that we do not use the term inner critic. We use the term inner friend and see this as something that is skillful, not that is negative.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Philip. I think what I hear you pointing to is highlighting our attitude towards this inner experience. So rather than having a particular take on what's happening, what's really important is how we're relating to it. And I hear your point about the term inner critic, but what it makes me think of is how do we meet our suffering with awareness? And the critical sense of this experience is something many people can relate to, that recognize it by. And what you're describing is exactly what we're doing in the course. We're kind of looking at the orientation towards this experience, how to understand why it comes around, why it's here. So the perspective is everything that arises in our experience arises for a reason. And in the Buddha's teaching, it's only when we really deeply understand the reason, the causes, that something can be met according to how it deeply needs to be met in order to come to peace, in order to come to some completion. So what's happening as I say this, Philip? Does this resonate with you, or?
No, not really, because I think that when you call it again, the inner critic, you are creating right from the get-go a defensive position. And if we can look at mindfulness as empathic co-regulation, as befriending, as reparenting our wounded child, then we are able to bring mindfulness to an understanding of something that is skillful, not negative and detrimental. So I really do see this as a completely different way of approaching it.
Yeah, and then maybe there's just different things work for different people. But actually what I hear and what you're saying is a lot of what we're bringing in to this course, that kind of contemplation of kindness and openness and discerning what's needed in response to this experience. So thank you for your perspective. I don't know if Gavin would like to add anything, or would you like to add anything, Gavin?
Just maybe just a couple of things. Thanks, Philip, for your question. And it's almost quite a big topic to sort of frame in a relatively short space of time. But I guess in terms of the Dharma teachings, the particularly self-abusive critical voice, which would be at really one end of the spectrum of what you might be alluding to, would fall kind of in the realm of the teachings on Mara and the teachings on the hindrances, all of which the invitation is to try to meet with kindness, but also not perpetuating and being kind of lost and caught up in them. And it's so tricky because even the word defilement in the Buddhist teachings, which is the word used, just has that really negative connotation, which I've also really struggled with myself. So I really do get the thrust of what you're saying there. I know in other spheres, when the inner critic is spoken about, it's often actually more the internalized parents or the internalized societal pressures. And I wonder if the more childlike voice, which is sometimes spoken of as the inner child, which can also be critical, is potentially a slightly different piece of the puzzle. And just to kind of offer that really, because this is kind of all our exploration, what actually moves us in the direction of what we really want to bring forth in this life. But I completely agree. The languaging for me always has a shadow side, and rather than calling it the inner critic, some people prefer to call it inner criticism. This is inner criticism happening, but it just doesn't sound so loaded, like we're somehow because we're trying to come out of inner conflict rather than create more inner conflict. So but I really appreciate you asking a question like that, because it's really important that we sort of clarify what's helpful in our own experience.
All right.
Thank you.
We have a question from Haney. I'm gonna unmute you.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Sorry, I'm not. It's fairly early for me, and I'm not so good with words. And I've never spoken on Zoom before, so it is a little bit of a trial. I've come through, so that's good. Sorry.
Take your time, Annie.
Yeah. I'm not going to come with a question. I'm quite happy what I've heard, and I am perhaps interested in doing the course that you're offering, depending on the time. And yeah, so yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing. So that'll be enough for me now. Thank you.
You're welcome. Just to say, Henny, that we're flexible. The course can be watched flexibly according to the timing that works for you. So just so you know that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Briefly.
Nice to meet you both. Yep.
Yeah.
I'd like to raise one question in the Q&A panel from Linda, which says, do you address the inner critic in your daily life or only in meditation?
Do you want to respond to that first, Gavin? Thank you for the question.
So yeah, my response would be both. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so you can think of it, the meditation is formal meditation is where we sort of practice the scales of the instrument, and then in our daily life, that's where we sort of explore playing some music and Yeah, you know, again, my sense of the direction of the path of meditation as a whole is increasingly trying to bring the very attitude that we're exploring on the cushion into the settings of our lives. And of course, that's really hard. It's a real challenge, but there's lots to be learned, and especially around the inner critic, because when that starts to be included in practice, it's often the thing in a situation in our daily life saying, this shouldn't be happening, I shouldn't be feeling this way, let me go upstairs very quickly and do some meditation practice. And then, you know, but to linger there a little bit in the settings of our lives, we might start to come into a different relationship with the critical voice that is sometimes trying to protect us from certain feelings or have us not feel those feelings, and starting to kind of feel those feelings is, in a sense, the sort of the direction of moving towards the end of suffering. So yes, both. And there's no the inner critical voice would like to set a bar as to how that should look. There is no bar. It's just exploring, and we can begin again in any moment.
And we have a question from James.
Hi, James.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between the inner critic and fears associated with external threats. So I find that my inner critic, my inner voice in that sense, recedes a bit when there are these ever-present, it seems these days, fears that are externally generated. I'm thinking about a pandemic that's killing thousands of people every day, an economy that's in tatters. In the United States, the threat of massive civil unrest, and an environment that's degrading and the effects of which are hanging over us all. I see for myself, I see the inner critic as a kind of in a dialectical dance with this externally generated threat that seems to be out there. The more threatening the world seems to become, the less pressing is my inner critic.
That's interesting. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, James, is all those things you described can make us very externally focused. So focused on the problems out there. And so perhaps the inner critic is less focused on attacking a sense of self that it sees as imperfect, and more oriented to the problems in the world, which are very compelling, naturally very compelling at the moment. So it could just simply be a sense of focus. And the other thing that comes to mind is quite often this inner critical voice shows up because it's trying to protect us from feeling or experiencing something. And quite often that can be feelings of fear or vulnerability. So it might be that in the face of all of these experiences, something in you is, as you're turning towards them, is with your fear and with your vulnerability, and finding out, I can be with this. I can feel these feelings as I'm with this experience. But I don't know if either of those resonate with you, James, as possibilities of what's happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's important for me to find that sense of stability these days. So yeah, but at the same time, I don't feel that the external issues are really all that, in a sense, out there. They're also my problems. So I try not to separate myself or see myself as outside of these problems. They're pressing in me, and I'm also in the problem itself. So as I said, there's a relationship between them, and trying to negotiate that relationship tends to, as I said before, tends to diminish the inner critic voice significantly, because I am dealing with all this other stuff that's happening out there and in here.
Right. So there's a kind of recognition of your capacity, would you say, of your capacity in the moment to show up in the way you're showing up.
Yeah, and and to feel as much as I can, while at the same time protecting myself. Feel this sense of pain and unease that the world is presenting at the moment.
Yeah, I think that is so helpful. It seems like it may not seem like a significant contribution to the world, but I think that is a really significant contribution. The degree to which we can feel how we're impacted, feel the reactions without being caught in our reactivity, keeps our heart open in these times.
Great. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want to hear for a little bit from Gavin? Do you want to add anything, Gavin, to what I've said?
I mean, just very, very briefly, James. Again, this is I sort of resonate with what Laura said, but you spoke about the dynamic, and there's this way in which the inner critic is in a dynamic with the outer the conditions of the world, in terms of the things that we might be perceived as going well and gaining and success and things working, and it tries to keep us sort of in a sweet spot in relationship to these things. So the teaching that could be interesting to explore is the teaching on the 8 worldly winds, and of course these worldly winds are blowing very, very strongly at the moment. So yeah, part of what you're noticing might be just the way that you're starting to notice the dynamic, which I think is a really rich thing to be in touch with, and to feel the effect that feel our experience with kind, gentle awareness is really the invitation in these teachings. So to touch on the teaching of the 8 worldly winds could be interesting, because that's what the inner critic's sort of trying to keep us in a particular sort of status quo with those. That's one of the ways of looking at it. So thank you for sharing that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, we're at about the top of the hour. So I'm mindful that it's getting quite late where our teachers are tonight. So just wanted to thank you both, Laura and Gavin, immensely for sharing this opportunity with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and this afternoon. If you'd like to continue studying and practicing around this topic with Laura and Gavin, their course Beyond the Inner Critic is still open for enrollment. So please do check that out at learn.tricycle.org if you're interested. And the recording of this session, as well as all of our previous sessions, will be on our YouTube channel, Tricycle's YouTube channel, and you can also find it at tricycle.org/live. We're really grateful to everyone who has donated to support these free offerings in the past, and if you are able to make a donation, we really appreciate that. You can also do that at tricycle.org/live. So I really thank everyone for being here, for taking the time to practice with us, and thank you, Laura and Gavin, so much.
Very welcome. Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, everyone.